Gideon Hartley figured he was buying 160 acres of dirt and debt. $40 was all it cost him. $40 for a patch of land so cursed, the prairie wind itself seemed to whisper warnings as it whipped across the plains. He reined in his horse at the edge of the old Dunnigan property, the sun painting the farmhouse in shades of rust and rot. Folks in town said the land had gone sour, that it had swallowed the Dunnigan family whole, leaving nothing behind but silence and whispers. Gideon wasn't a man for ghost stories, but as he spat into the dry earth, he could taste the bitterness on his tongue. "You still think this is where we're meant to be?" Martha asked. She dismounted with a quiet grace, her face a roadmap of hard years and quiet heartaches. She had the hands of a woman who could have raised a dozen children if fate hadn't been so cruel. "It's a start, Martha," Gideon said, but the words felt like stones in his throat. The house stood before them like a tired old man, 2 stories of weary wood, a sagging porch, and a roof that seemed to be in a fistfight with the sky. It wasn't much, but the deed said it was theirs. By sundown, they'd settled in. The horses were stabled in a barn that looked one strong wind away from giving up entirely. Martha, bless her soul, was already sweeping the kitchen for the second time, chasing out what she called the hauntings. Gideon knew she was just trying to scrub her own hope into the floorboards, but the old house wouldn't settle. It groaned and creaked, the walls whispering secrets they couldn't understand. The prairie sky turned to a deep, bruised indigo, and the stars came out like chips of ice. It was a lonely, terrible beauty, and then, near midnight, he heard it, a soft thud, almost nothing, like a single boot tapping on wood, somewhere upstairs. Gideon sat bolt upright in their makeshift bed, his hand moving on pure instinct, closing around the cold steel of the shotgun he kept by his side. "Martha," he whispered, "you hear that?" She was already out of bed, her silhouette moving in the moonlight. She lit a lantern, her hands steady as a surgeon's. She'd heard it too. The sound came again, clearer this time. A shuffle, a faint, dragging noise, right above their heads. In the attic. "Just a raccoon?" Gideon muttered, trying to convince himself more than her, but his gut twisted into a knot. "Raccoons don't shuffle. They skitter." "That's the biggest, heaviest raccoon I've ever heard," Martha shot back, her voice tight. Gideon took the lead, shotgun in one hand, lantern in the other. The light threw dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls as they climbed the stairs. Each step groaned a protest, the whole house seeming to hold its breath with them. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway led to a single trapdoor in the ceiling. A simple rope cord hung down. As Gideon reached for it, the air went cold, still, and in that stillness, he heard it, a whisper, faint, terrified, the whisper of a child. His heart hammered against his ribs. He yanked the cord. The trapdoor swung down with a bang, unleashing a cloud of dust that choked the lamplight. And in the swirling gloom of the attic, 5 faces stared back at him. Their eyes were huge, reflecting the lantern light like cornered animals. 5 small bodies huddled together in the darkness, looking like they were ready to die. Gideon's finger was tight on the trigger. The shotgun felt heavy, deadly. The 5 faces stared down the barrel, frozen in terror. He saw a boy, maybe 15, with eyes far too old for his face. A girl next to him, her chin jutted out in defiance. 3 smaller ones behind them, clinging to each other like they were the last 5 people on Earth. Just as Gideon's mind was trying to make sense of it, the oldest boy spoke. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a man's weight. "Don't shoot, mister," he said. "We ain't thieves. We got nowhere else to go." The words hit Gideon harder than a punch. He slowly, carefully lowered the shotgun. The relief that washed over the children's faces was a physical thing, like a wave you could feel. But Martha didn't hesitate. She stepped right past Gideon, holding the lantern high, as if she'd been expecting them all along, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "Come on down from there, children," she said, her voice softer than he'd heard it in years. "You all look half-starved." One by one, they scrambled down the rickety ladder. They were a ragtag bunch, their clothes little more than patched-up rags, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. The oldest boy, Ephraim, stood protectively in front of the others. "This here is Susanna," he said, nodding to the sharp-eyed girl who looked about 13. "That's Levi, Millie, and little Jonah." Jonah, the youngest, couldn't have been more than 5. He was clutching a tattered stuffed bear like it was a holy relic, his thumb stuck firmly in his mouth. "We didn't mean you no trouble," Ephraim said quickly, his eyes darting from Gideon to Martha. "We've been staying real quiet. Just needed a roof over our heads after what happened." Gideon and Martha exchanged a look. The air was thick with unspoken questions. What happened? Who were they? But Martha just knelt, her hardened farm wife face softening into something Gideon hadn't seen in a decade. "You've been living up there? All by yourselves?" she asked softly. It was Susanna who answered, her voice small but clear as a bell. "Since spring, since Cash Drayton's men made our folks disappear." The name landed in the room like a physical blow. Cash Drayton. The man owned half the valley, and what he didn't own, he squeezed until it bled. He was a cancer on this land, a man who built his empire on the backs of broken families. "These Dunnigans, they kin to you?" Gideon asked, his voice rough. "No, sir," Ephraim said, shaking his head. "Their place was just empty. We didn't think anyone would ever buy it. Folks said it was haunted." "Well, reckon someone did," Gideon muttered, his eyes drifting over the worn-out faces of the children. He'd come here looking for a fresh start, a place to build a life. He never imagined he'd find 5 lives already here, waiting, broken and scared. He looked at Martha. Her eyes were glistening in the lamplight. She wasn't seeing 5 strangers. She was seeing the family she'd prayed for, delivered to her doorstep in the dead of night. "They're staying, Gideon," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration. "At least until we can figure things out." Gideon looked from his wife's determined face to the 5 pairs of weary eyes staring up at him. Hope, fear, they were all mixed up in their gazes. He let out a long breath, the weight of the world settling on his shoulders. He slung the shotgun back over his shoulder. "All right," he said gruffly, "but first thing tomorrow, we're going to talk about this Drayton business." As they made makeshift beds on the parlor floor, the old house felt different. It was still creaky, still groaning, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the quiet hum of a family being born from ashes. But out on the ridge, under the cold, indifferent stars, Gideon knew someone was watching. Drayton's men. They were always watching. He had paid $40 for a cursed farm. What he'd actually bought was a war. Morning came sharp and cold. Gideon sat on the porch, a sliver of straw between his teeth, shotgun resting across his knees. His eyes weren't on the rising sun. They were scanning the eastern ridges, the same ridges where Drayton's land began. This little homestead, which had felt so small and isolated yesterday, now felt like the most crowded place on earth. Inside, the smell of oatmeal and wood smoke filled the air. Martha was humming. Humming. Gideon couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her hum. She moved around the kitchen like she'd been born to it, fussing over the children, stirring a big pot like it was the most important job in the world. "They've been hungry too long, Gideon," she'd said when he pointed out their own meager supplies. "What's a few less mouthfuls for us, when this might be their first warm meal in weeks?" He didn't argue. He knew that look in her eye. She wasn't just feeding 5 hungry bellies. She was feeding a part of her own soul that had been starving for years. The children sat around the rickety table, spoons held tight in their hands. They ate with a desperate, silent intensity at first. But a warm meal has a way of melting even the iciest suspicion. It was Susanna who finally broke the silence. She looked straight at Gideon, her eyes unnervingly perceptive. "Our pa used to say every man's got a line. A line where his kindness stops and his survival starts. Guess we're going to find out where yours is, Mr. Hartley." Martha nearly dropped the pot. Gideon just grunted, taking a long sip of his coffee. "You'll find my line is a little further out than most reckon," he said. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. As the morning wore on, the full story started to spill out. Not in a rush, but in bits and pieces, like water seeping through a cracked dam. Their parents, Jacob and Ellen Whitlock, had been tenant farmers on Drayton's land. They worked a patch down by the river bottom. But Drayton's version of a contract was more like a spider's web. The harder you struggled, the more tangled you became. He kept upping the debt, Ephraim said, his voice flat and empty. Said we owed for new seed we never got. Charged us for water from a river that belonged to God. Every month Pa worked himself to the bone, and every month we owed more. Martha's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Gideon just listened, his jaw a knot of granite. One day, Ephraim continued, his eyes dark with memory, Pa told Drayton he'd had enough. Told him to his face he was a thief and a liar. Said no piece of paper gave a man the right to starve another man's family. A heavy silence fell over the table. 3 days later, Susanna whispered, her voice brittle, the barn caught fire. They said it was lightning, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Ephraim stared into his empty bowl. Our Pa, he was inside. Gideon felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't just bullying. This was murder. Reuben Fisk came the next night, Susanna added. Reuben Fisk, Drayton's right-hand man, a snake with a silver tongue and a fast gun. Fisk told our ma that Mr. Drayton was willing to forgive the debt, now that there wasn't a man left to pay it. He said she and us, we were the final payment. They all knew what that meant, indentured servitude, slavery in all but name. Ma packed us a bag that night, Ephraim said. Told us to run, to hide. She said she'd hold them off, give us a head start. We ran to the woods. We heard a gunshot. His voice broke. He didn't have to say the rest. They'd been on their own ever since, hiding in the abandoned Dunnigan place, surviving on rabbits and stolen vegetables, praying no one would ever find them. Until now. Martha wiped her hands on her apron, her face set like stone. Well, she said, her voice ringing with a strength Gideon hadn't heard in forever. It seems to me this house has been empty long enough. It's got a roof, 4 walls, and now it's got people who need it. It was decided. The Whitlock children were now the Hartley children. Later that afternoon, Gideon found Ephraim out by the fence line, trying to mend a busted post with nothing but grit and a rusty hammer. You handle that thing pretty well, Gideon said, walking up behind him. Ephraim didn't look up. Had to learn quick. Can't be a slow learner when you're trying to keep 4 other mouths fed. Gideon crouched beside him, picking up a handful of rusted nails. He started hammering one into the wood, the rhythm of the work a steady beat between them. You know, Gideon said softly, you remind me of myself at your age, full of vinegar and ready to take on the world. Ephraim finally looked at him, a flicker of something in his guarded eyes. Is that a good thing? Gideon gave a half smile. Surviving ain't the hard part, boy. That's just instinct. It's what you do after you've survived. That's what tells the world what kind of man you are. Their conversation was cut short by a movement on the ridge. 2 riders, distant silhouettes against the harsh blue sky. They weren't just passing through. They were sitting on their horses, still as statues, watching. Ephraim's hand instinctively went to the hunting knife at his belt. Drayton's men, he muttered. Gideon stood up slowly, his hand tightening on the fence post until the splintered wood dug into his palm. Could be, he said, his voice low. Or they could just be curious. But he knew better. Curious men don't linger on a ridgeline like vultures waiting for something to die. They were sending a message. We see you. We know what you're hiding. As the riders finally turned and disappeared back over the ridge, Gideon felt that familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He'd wanted a simple life, a quiet piece of land. Instead, he was standing on a powder keg, and someone had just lit the fuse. The quiet didn't last. The message from the ridge was just the opening shot. The real war arrived on horseback, in the form of a man named Reuben Fisk. He rode up the path to the homestead slow and easy, his black horse moving like it had all the time in the world. Fisk himself sat tall in the saddle, his boots polished to a mirror shine, a grin on his face that didn't belong anywhere near a decent man's home. Gideon watched him come from the porch, his thumb gently stroking the smooth, worn stock of his shotgun. Beside him, Martha stood with her arms crossed, her apron still dusted with flour, but her eyes were cold as a winter river. "Morning, Hartley," Fisk called out, his voice smooth as whiskey. He dismounted, letting the reins drop. His horse wouldn't dare move. Heard you finally decided to fill up this old nest. Guess congratulations are in order. Gideon didn't say a word. He just watched Fisk's boots crunch on the dry gravel as he walked closer. His hands were loose at his sides, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. The patched-up fence, the new shutter on the window, the 5 small faces peeking out from behind the curtains. Word travels fast in these parts, Fisk continued, his friendly smile never wavering. Folks are wondering what a man like you is doing, taking in a litter of strays. Seems an odd fit for a man with no children of his own. The insult was meant to sting, and it did. But Martha stepped forward before Gideon could react. "They're children, Mr. Fisk," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Not stray cattle." Fisk let out a soft chuckle, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Oh, I don't doubt that, ma'am. No doubt at all. The trouble is, those particular children are, in a manner of speaking, property. They belong to Mr. Drayton." Gideon's grip on the shotgun tightened. His knuckles went white. "You see," Fisk went on, his eyes flicking to the gun and then back to Gideon's face, "their father left behind a rather significant debt. A debt that Mr. Drayton, in his generosity, is willing to collect in other ways. Those children, they are the outstanding balance." "That's a lie," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. "Is it?" Fisk's smile widened. "I've got the papers, signed by Jacob Whitlock himself. Indenture contracts. Perfectly legal. He signed his children over as collateral against his debts." This was a new twist, a horrifying one. A forged document, no doubt, but one that a corrupt judge would uphold in a heartbeat. Drayton wasn't just a murderer, he was meticulous. "Now, I'm a reasonable man," Fisk said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false peace. "I ain't here to cause a ruckus. Mr. Drayton just wants what's his. You seem like decent folks. It'd be a shame for you to get tangled up in business that doesn't concern you. Best thing for everyone is you just send them on out here. Quiet like. No one has to get hurt." The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate a man. The wind whistled through the eaves of the old house. Martha's eyes never left Fisk's. "We won't be sending those children anywhere," she said, each word a block of granite. "You can go back and tell Mr. Drayton that the Hartleys don't deal in human property." Fisk's smile finally vanished. The friendly mask slipped, revealing the cold, predatory thing underneath. His eyes narrowed. "That's a mistake, ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A real big one. Mr. Drayton always collects what's owed. He's a very persistent man." He tipped his hat, a gesture of pure mockery, and turned back to his horse. As he swung himself into the saddle, he called back over his shoulder, "I'll be sure to let Mr. Drayton know how protective you are of his interests. I reckon he'll be paying a visit himself. Soon." They watched him ride away, a dark stain against the prairie, his threat hanging in the air like poison. That evening, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The children were huddled in the parlor, the weight of Fisk's visit pressing down on them. Gideon found Levi in the small workshop behind the house. The boy was working on the back door, trying to fit a new, stronger lock. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his small hands working with a startling precision. "You've got a good hand with that, son," Gideon said quietly. Levi didn't look up. Door felt weak, figured it needed to be stronger. Gideon watched him work. This wasn't just a boy fixing a door. This was a boy trying to build a wall against the monsters of the world. He was trying to hold his family together with wood and iron. "You know," Gideon said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "this place, it ain't just a roof over our heads anymore. It's a fortress. And you, Levi, you're its chief engineer." For the first time, Levi looked up and smiled. A real, genuine smile. It was like seeing the sun break through the clouds. "Yes, sir," he said. "I reckon I can do that." Later that night, long after the others were asleep, Gideon sat by the window, his shotgun across his lap. He knew Fisk's visit was just the beginning. A warning shot. The real battle was still to come. He looked at the sleeping forms of the children, their chests rising and falling in the soft moonlight. These weren't just lost souls he'd taken in. They were his now. They were his family. and he'd realized something profound as Fisk rode away. He wasn't just fighting for them. He was fighting for himself, for the man he'd always wanted to be, a father, a protector, and no man, not Cash Drayton, not Reuben Fisk, not the devil himself, was going to take that away from him. The days after Fisk's visit were a blur of sweat, sawdust, and grim determination. The Hartley homestead wasn't just being repaired, it was being transformed. It was becoming a fortress, built not just of wood and nails, but of pure, unadulterated defiance. Levi became a whirlwind of activity. He was up at dawn, his hammer a constant, rhythmic beat against the prairie silence. He didn't just fix the front gate, he rebuilt it, reinforcing it with scavenged iron until it looked like it could hold back a charging bull. He had an uncanny eye for weakness, finding every loose board, every creaky floorboard, every window that didn't latch just right. He was building a shell, a hard outer layer to protect the soft, vulnerable heart of their new family. Susanna, meanwhile, turned the small yard into an apothecary's workshop. She had jars of strange-smelling herbs, bundles of dried leaves hanging from the porch rafters. She ground paste for burns and brewed tinctures for cuts. But she was also doing something else, something stranger. Gideon saw her marking symbols on the doorposts with chalk made from ground-up bone and herbs. "What's all this, Susanna?" he asked one afternoon. She looked at him with those old, knowing eyes. "Pa taught me some of the old ways," she said. "Ways to make a place strong, to keep bad things out." It might have been superstition, but Gideon didn't stop her. In a fight against a man like Drayton, he'd take any advantage he could get. And then there was Ephraim. Gideon took the boy out to the fields every afternoon, the old Winchester rifle in his hands. He was teaching him how to shoot, not just to hunt rabbits, but to defend his home, to defend his family. The boy was a natural, his hands were steady, his eye was true. But Gideon saw the conflict in him, the heavy weight of what he was being asked to do. "You don't have to like it, son," Gideon told him, his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You just have to be good at it. When the time comes, you can't hesitate. You focus on the target, not the fear. The fear never goes away. You just get better at aiming right through it." The homestead was changing. It was no longer a sad, sagging house. It was a statement. It was a line drawn in the dirt. But amidst all the hard work, something else was happening. Something miraculous. Laughter. One evening they were all gathered around the dinner table. The air was thick with the smell of the stew and cornbread, and for the first time it felt like a home. Jonah was sitting on Gideon's knee, babbling about a frog he'd found. Millie was proudly showing off a new dress Martha had sewn for her from an old flour sack. Susanna was telling a story that made Levi snort with laughter. Even Ephraim, usually so solemn, was smiling. In that moment, the world outside, the world with Cash Drayton and his threats, it just disappeared. There was no debt, no danger. There was just this, a family, whole and alive. But peace in this part of the world was a fragile, fleeting thing. It came in the dead of night. The first sound was a crash of glass against the barn wall. Then a whoosh as a ball of fire erupted in the darkness, painting the night sky in shades of orange and red. The smell of kerosene hit Gideon a split second later. "Fire!" Ephraim's shout ripped through the house. Gideon was out the door before the shout had faded, rifle in his hand. Martha was already herding the younger children towards the root cellar, her face a mask of calm fury. Susanna grabbed her bag of herbs and followed Gideon out into the yard. Figures moved in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Shadows of men. And then he heard the laughter. Mocking, cruel laughter, as another bottle filled with fire arced through the air and smashed against the other side of the barn. The fire roared, a hungry beast devouring the old dry wood. Gideon raised his rifle, but Reuben Fisk's voice cut through the crackle of the flames. "Evening, Hartley. Just figured your place looked a little cold. Thought we'd come by and warm it up for you." Gideon couldn't see him clearly through the smoke and flames, but he knew that sneering voice. He fired a shot into the darkness, not aiming to hit, but to warn. The laughter stopped. "You'll find the house is a mite less flammable," Gideon yelled back. Fisk's tone dropped, losing its mocking edge and turning cold as ice. Cash Drayton doesn't like slow learners, Hartley. You're trespassing. On his property. On his children. This is your last warning. Next time, it won't be the barn. The roof of the barn groaned, and then collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and embers. The men melted back into the darkness, their work done. The family stood together in the yard, watching the flames consume what was left of the barn, the heart of their homestead reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. Millie was crying silently, clinging to Martha's skirt. Jonah stared, his eyes wide with a confusion too deep for a child to understand. But it was Ephraim who Gideon watched. The boy didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight, watching the fire with a quiet, burning fury that mirrored Gideon's own. When the last flame finally died, leaving a blackened skeleton against the starry sky, Gideon pulled them all in close. "They think this will scare us," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They think we'll pack up and run." He looked at each of their faces, illuminated by the dying embers. Levi, his face streaked with soot, his hands already clenched into fists, ready to rebuild. Susanna, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a cold resolve. "They don't know who they're dealing with," Martha said, her hand finding Gideon's in the dark. "This isn't just a house anymore. This is our line in the sand." Ephraim's voice when he spoke was quiet, but it held the strength of tempered steel. "They took our family from us once. They're not going to do it again." Gideon looked at these children, his children, and he saw not victims, but warriors. The barn was gone, but the fire they had started had lit something inside of them, a fire that would not be so easily extinguished. "Then we build it stronger," Gideon said. "We make this place a fortress, because when they come back, and they will come back, we won't be hiding." His eyes scanned the darkness, out towards the ridge where Drayton's land began. "We'll be waiting." The sun was just a bloody smear on the eastern horizon when the dust began to rise. A dozen riders, moving not with the casual pace of cowboys, but with the grim purpose of an army. At their head, sitting on a pristine white stallion, was Cash Drayton himself. He held a silver-tipped cane across his saddle, and the smile on his face was a chilling slash in the pale morning light. Beside him, Reuben Fisk rode with his usual lazy menace. "They're early," Martha murmured from the porch, the shotgun she was holding looking like a natural extension of her arm. Gideon's eyes never left the approaching riders. "That's because they think today is going to be easy." But today was not going to be easy, because Cash Drayton wasn't riding up to a simple farmhouse. He was riding into a trap. The Hartleys had worked through the night. Levi, moving like a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom, had rigged tripwires across the fields, connected to nothing more than stacks of old pots and pans. But in the tense silence, they would sound like gunshots. He dug shallow pits, hidden under layers of dried grass, just deep enough to twist a horse's ankle and throw a rider. Near the porch, Susanna had lit bundles of sage and something else, something with a thick, acrid smoke. The wind, as if by her command, carried the dense plumes across the field, creating a shifting, swirling curtain that obscured sight lines and stung the eyes. It wasn't magic, it was tactical. She was using the land itself as a weapon. Ephraim stood shoulder to shoulder with Gideon on the porch, the Winchester cradled in his arms. The last traces of boyhood had been burned away from him in the barn fire. He was a soldier now, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the enemy. "They'll come straight for the house," Ephraim said. "Let 'em," Gideon replied, his voice a low rumble. Drayton and his men reined in just beyond the newly rebuilt gate. Drayton dismounted, his expensive boots crunching on the gravel. He strode forward, Fisk and two other thugs at his side, leaving the rest of his men mounted in a menacing semicircle. "Mr. Hartley," Drayton called out, his voice dripping with false civility. "I do admire a man who puts up a fight, but I figure we can end this now, neighborly-like." Gideon stepped off the porch to meet him, Ephraim a silent shadow at his back. Martha remained in the doorway, a stoic guardian. "You brought a crowd, Drayton," Gideon said, his voice calm. Expecting a parade? Drayton chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Just making sure we're thorough. Now I hear tell you've taken in some children. Children who belong to me. I'm here to claim what's mine. This was the moment. Gideon reached into the leather satchel at his side, but he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a stack of papers. Old, crumpled, dirt-streaked papers. You mean these? Gideon's voice rang out, sharp and clear, carrying across the field. He held the papers high for all to see. These are the debt contracts, the ones Jacob Whitlock supposedly signed. Drayton's smile tightened. That's right. Perfectly legal. Funny thing about that, Gideon continued, his voice getting louder. I took a ride into town last night, paid a visit to the Territorial Records Office. Found something interesting. The official ledger, the one that tracks all land grants and registered debts. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Drayton's men were shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. From over the ridge, a few townspeople had appeared, drawn by the commotion, watching from a safe distance. Turns out, Gideon boomed, there's no record of any debt owed by Jacob Whitlock to you, Drayton. None at all. Which means these papers you're holding, they're forgeries. The word hung in the air. Forgeries. Drayton's face went from smug to thunderous. Fisk stepped forward, his hand hovering over his gun. That's a mighty bold accusation, Hartley. It gets better, Gideon said, a grim smile touching his lips. He turned his head slightly, nodding toward the road. A lone rider was approaching, a rider with a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Thaddeus Pike. Pike had always been a man who bent whichever way the wind blew, and for years that wind had been Cash Drayton. But as he rode up, there was a new steel in his spine. Sheriff, Drayton snarled, turning to face him, this is a private matter. Doesn't look private to me, Cash, Pike said, his voice surprisingly steady. Looks like attempted kidnapping, based on fraudulent documents. And that's on top of the arson you committed 2 nights ago. Got a witness who saw your men riding away from the fire. Drayton's face was a mask of fury. I own half this valley, Pike. I own you. Not anymore, Pike said, and his hand slowly moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. You see, the thing about folks out here, Cash, they don't take kindly to men who burn down barns, and they sure as hell don't take kindly to men who try to steal children. Suddenly, a sharp cry went up from Drayton's men. One of the riders had strayed too close to the fence line, and his horse had stumbled into one of Levi's hidden pits. The man was thrown, landing hard. Panic rippled through the rest of the mounted men as they realized the field wasn't safe. At the same moment, the wind shifted, and a thick cloud of Susanna's smoke billowed directly into their faces, causing horses to rear and men to cough and curse. Drayton was outflanked, not by guns but by truth, by community, and by the cleverness of the very children he'd tried to claim. He looked from Gideon's unyielding face to the sheriff's steady gaze, to his own panicked men. He was losing in front of the whole town. This isn't over, Hartley, he spat, his voice shaking with rage. It's over for today, Drayton, Gideon said, his voice hard as iron. Now get off my land. Seething, defeated, Drayton turned. He and his men retreated, their proud advance turning into a chaotic, clumsy withdrawal. As they disappeared over the ridge, the townspeople started walking forward, no longer watching from a distance but closing the space, their faces showing not pity, but respect. Sheriff Pike dismounted, taking off his hat. Hartley, he said, his voice filled with a weary admiration. You and your family. You did what the rest of us were too scared to do for years. You stood up. Gideon looked at his family. Martha on the porch, strong and steady. Susanna and Levi, small but fierce. And Ephraim at his side, the rifle held with a confidence that broke Gideon's heart and made it swell with pride all at once. They had faced the dragon, and for today they had won. We're just getting started, Sheriff, Gideon said, watching as Millie and Jonah ran out of the house and into Martha's arms. We're just getting started. Cash Drayton's retreat wasn't the gallop of a beaten man. It was the slow, seething withdrawal of a wounded predator, promising revenge with every resentful hoofbeat. You think this is over, Hartley? Drayton's voice, raw with fury, echoed back across the field. He pointed his silver-tipped cane like a sword. I'll bury you in the courts. I'll buy every judge from here to Cheyenne. You'll be begging me to take this dirt heap off your hands just to pay your lawyer's fees." Gideon stood his ground, his hands resting calmly on his belt. He was as unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. "Then you'd best start saving your money, Drayton," he called back, "'cause this family ain't for sale." The townspeople, who for years had lived under Drayton's thumb, now stood behind the Hartleys. Their whispers grew louder, their fear slowly being replaced by a shared, simmering courage. Drayton's empire was built on fear, and its foundations were cracking. As Drayton's men vanished, Sheriff Pike remained, his face etched with the weight of a man finally shedding a heavy burden. He stepped forward, holding out a worn leather folder. "I reckon folks have called me a lot of things, Hartley," Pike said, his voice gravelly. "Most of 'em not too flattering. But today I'd rather be remembered as the man who finally did the right damn thing." Inside the folder were sworn affidavits from other farmers Drayton had cheated, copies of the forged documents, and Pike's own official report on the arson and the confrontation. It was a nail for Drayton's coffin. "I'll see this gets to the circuit judge myself," Pike said. "No more backroom deals, no more bought silence. You have my word." Gideon took the folder. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the start of one. It was the promise of justice, something as rare and precious as rain in this dry land. As the crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their homes with a newfound sense of hope, Gideon turned to his family. Martha, her face smudged with soot, looked more beautiful to him than ever. Ephraim lowered the rifle, his shoulders finally slumping slightly, the weight of the battle lifting. Susanna's eyes, usually so serious, held a spark of triumph, while Levi was already walking the perimeter, assessing the damage to his defenses, his mind already on rebuilding. Gideon breathed in the scent of burnt wood and sage smoke. This land had been a graveyard for his dreams. Now it was the foundation of something real, something alive. That evening, the family gathered around the kitchen table. The meal was simple, beans and cornbread, but it felt like a feast. The air was filled with a quiet, exhausted peace. "I've been thinking," Gideon said, breaking the comfortable silence. "This homestead, it shouldn't just carry the Hartley name anymore." Ephraim looked up, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean, sir?" Gideon's eyes, filled with a deep paternal love, swept over each of them. Millie, who had started to hum again. Jonah, asleep with his head on the table, a crumb of cornbread on his cheek. Levi and Susanna, watching him intently. Ephraim, the young man who had become the rock of his siblings. I figure it's time we made this official. Martha and we want you to be ours, all of you, if you'll have us." Martha's hand found Gideon's across the table, her grip firm and sure. "We may not have given you life," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but you've brought life back to us." A sacred silence filled the room. It was Susanna who finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We'd be proud to carry the Hartley name." The legal papers could wait. The courts and judges could take their time. In that small kitchen under a roof patched with love and defiance, they were already a family, forged not by blood, but by fire. Later, as dusk settled over the prairie, Gideon stood on the porch. The wooden boards creaked a familiar welcome beneath his boots. He watched Ephraim and Levi chasing Jonah across the field, their laughter echoing like a prayer in the quiet evening air. Millie was dancing with her tattered doll, and Susanna sat on the fence rail, humming a soft tune. Martha came to stand beside him, sliding her arm through his. Together they watched their homestead, their family, their future. "You know," Martha said softly, resting her head on his shoulder, "I used to think God had cursed this place. Cursed us. No children, no future. Just dust and silence." Gideon didn't answer right away. He watched Ephraim lift Jonah high onto his shoulders, the little boy's squeals of joy rising up to meet the first stars peeking out in the twilight sky. "Seems to me, Martha," Gideon said, his voice rough with unshed tears. Maybe he was just waiting for the right ones to find their way home. Martha smiled, a true radiant smile that erased the years of hardship from her face. "Maybe some children aren't born from their parents," she whispered. "Maybe they're born for them." Gideon felt something inside him, something that had been rusted shut for years, finally creak open. It was hope, fierce and fragile and beautiful, like the first green shoot pushing its way through parched earth. "I reckon this place will bloom after all," he murmured. He looked out at his children, their laughter a melody against the vast, quiet canvas of the night. He had bought a piece of land, hoping for a new start. Instead, he'd found a home. He'd found a purpose. He'd found a family. And that was worth more than all the land in Wyoming. This story is a powerful reminder that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the people you choose to fight for. The Hartleys didn't just stand up to a bully. They built a home out of courage and a family out of love. They proved that even on the most barren ground, something beautiful can grow if you're willing to water it with sweat and defend it with everything you have. If you enjoyed this story of grit, justice, and the power of a chosen family, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got another tale brewing out yonder, one where a lone prospector finds something more valuable than gold, and a whole lot more dangerous. You won't want to miss it.